Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show, to Brother Ugawa, Kurt Thomas, Gloria Busco, M. Jewel, Sister Robin, and the others that will come on. You're in for a real treat today. We have on this show a brother who's been a regular. He's been on a number of times, and he's covered a number of different subjects. When we were dealing with the election of Trump, we had him on. He's dealt a couple of times with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He's the foremost expert on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We've had him on discussing his research work. The last time was on the Sudan and his research in the Sudan. So Professor Manu Ampim, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, Doc. I'm glad to be back to be with you in the audience.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. This is one of my favorite people and scholars. And one of the reasons is that he's not just good at his work, his research, and his writing, but his character is consistent with his work. And he's a real good brother. And he's a community scholar, meaning that his work is shared with the community. And while he has a primary focus on ancient African history, he also has an interest in other things, as this discussion or this writing on King. He wrote his master's thesis on the revolutionary Martin Luther King, which I know is going to be turned into a book. There's no writing as good as that on King. And then his work on the myth that white people waved a wand at us in slavery and brainwashed us. And he had to be pretty good to figure out not only the lie behind Willie Lynch, because come on now. So the guy who lynched you, his name is Willie Lynch. That is suspicious in and of itself. But then he profiled him and he did a whole lot of stuff. And so he wrote the book exploding the myth of Willie Lynch, but some of you are so tied to it, you still want to believe it. And so I hear people say, okay, there was no Willie Lynch, but that's what happened. Oh, really? Do you know what happened? Crack a book. Listen to the spirituals. You hear me? Read the slave narratives. Read the accounts of Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, a variety of read. Maybe you could lead, you know what I mean? So that was and that was a little short piece you did on Willie Lynch. Congratulations, brother.
I appreciate it. I didn't have any choice because, as a professionally trained historian, people were coming up to me with the wild myth that, some big bad white dude in 1712 somehow gave a short 8-paragraph speech that 300 years later explains exactly how Black people are controlled. And so I finally had to smash that and do a presentation for the ages. I said, if y'all want me to participate in this conference, this symposium, then I don't want to waste my time. And I said, you know what? They keep pressuring me to participate, so let me lay it on them. And so I laid it on them and told them that documentation beats conversation, and this wild myth has nothing to do with historical reality. And it just took off from there. And I even forced out the forger to admit that he created this phony document, quote unquote document in the 70s. So it's just part of my work, Doc.
And you profiled him. You told me before you figured out about his age, and how did you do that? How did you figure that one out?
Well, being in the community, as you say, it's not just, in academia, talking with other professors and scholars and administrators in the academy. I'm in the community, and I recognize that, look, this was somebody from the community who put together this fake and phony speech to, quote unquote, wake us up, because nothing in there was really negative. Like, for example, in 1712, the forger would have us believe that some racist slave owner would be using the word Black to describe people of African descent with a capital B. Come on, that didn't take place until the Black Power movement, which you know so well, in June of '66. Nobody was capitalizing B to represent Black folks. So I knew it was an inside person who didn't know much about the history of Black folks and knew very little about the U.S., but it was an insider who didn't quite understand certain things. He talked about King James. Well, King James had been dead a whole century. Nobody would have been thinking about King James in the early 1700s. It would have been Queen Anne. And I knew there was somebody who knew that Black folks knew about King James because of the King James version of the Bible, and that would have an emotional impact, as well as using the word lynch. And there was so many contradictions. I knew that it had to be somebody who wrote or who produced the phony and fake speech in the latter 20th century. It had to be a brother, because brothers are typically more aggressive. Somebody in their 20s or 30s, because older folks have better things to do with their time. And anybody younger than their 20s would not know the nuances that were put in the fake and phony speech. So it was pretty clear there was a brother in his 20s or 30s, didn't have much background, and wanted to wake us up. And so when Dr. Kwame and I read that, his words exactly were, "Damn, the brother got me." And that's why he came out and sent me a confession letter that said, "Damn, man, you laid it out. I had to come out." And I interrogated him.
His name is what?
Dr. Kwame Ashanti. And he was at North Carolina, A&T at the time. He was just before retirement. And he specialized in not only psychology, but even more than that, his micro specialty was in brainwashing. and so he admitted all this, so when I called and he wrote a confession letter, I didn't even look at it right away because I got so much correspondence about this fake and phony alleged speech. And then finally I had some downtime. I went through some old emails and read it. It was months later, and I saw that he left a confession letter. Instead of I'm the one, said Professor Manu Ampim gets the credit for this, for bringing me out. And I called, he left the number. I called him to not just immediately accept anything, but to interrogate him. I had a whole list of questions. and he passed the test. And I looked it up after our conversation, and this brother at the time had everything to lose. Here you have a credible faculty member or administrator at a accredited university. And his credibility was on the line. So to just put that out there, knowing that he had a lot to lose, I weighed that plus his answer. I said, "Why did you use the word Willie Lynch?" He said, "Well, I just needed the name." And Willie's pretty common in the South. And he figured that Lynch would have an emotional impact on people. And I asked him, "Why did you put it together?" He said, "Well, we had a study group, and there were no bookstores in Durham at the time. So he said that they created a whole bunch of fake documents, and they just so if they had the information, then they would put out a leaflet based on the information they had. But if they didn't have information," he said, "they just created whatever they thought might be accurate." And so he said when he took the lead and put out the so-called Willie Lynch speech, he didn't think twice about it, and then was shocked that it continued to move on and took on a life of his own. But he said he didn't think a lot about it until he read my critique of this phony, fake. People say it's a letter, but it's actually supposed to be a speech. And besides, the speech doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Talking about lynching black folks. Nobody was lynching black folks in the early 1700s. That was not a dastardly phenomenon until after the Civil War ended in the 1860s. So I knew that the person didn't know much about U.S. history, was an insider, had to be a brother, because women typically are not that aggressive putting out these kind of phony wake-up call type of "did you know" Ripley's Believe It or Not documents. So I had actually walked away from it, but it continued to have a life on its own, and publishers from magazines kept contacting me, wanting to reprint my essays, or people had me on as guests. And then I remember there was the Now Valley Conference back in 2011 in Atlanta. This was the second International Now Valley Conference. The first one was in '84, the historic one. And then 27 years later, there was a conference in Atlanta. And I remember I was sitting in one of the presentations, and Paul Coates from Black Classic Press in Baltimore, he was sitting in front of me. And there was a brother from I think he was from Detroit. And he came, and because they had just published a couple of my essays on the Willie Lynch hoax. And it was on the front cover of a publication called Our Story. So the brother was bringing me some copies to distribute. But because I was sitting behind Paul Coates, when the brother reached over to give me a bundle of the Our Story, that issues of Our Story, Paul, he kind of reached up because he saw the Willie Lynch myth on the front cover. So let me see that. So he went through it. And he got emotional. Said, "Brother, we need to publish your work. It's nonsense." And he used some explicatives, and I said, "Okay, that's fine." He followed up a few months later, said, "Please send me all your work. We want to keep the book small so they can compete with the other propaganda books out there for just a few dollars for each book." And he published it. So it's Death of the Willie Lynch Speech, Exposing the Myth. And so but I'm glad to be able to make that contribution, because the Ripley's Believe It or Not whirlwind alleged documents and speeches, it keeps black folks in an ignorant mode. And besides, all those folks that still want to believe this, you know what, Doc, I shifted them. They first were saying that Willie Lynch was real and this is what happened to, all of that. But after reading my work, and I pinned them against the wall to shake them down to get rid of the nonsense, because I've been working to get a law passed, and we've made a lot of progress. It's a law against the spread of ignorance. And we got people that have joined that campaign, a law against the spread of ignorance in the U.S. and Canada, the Caribbean. I got some folks on board from Africa. And this is our campaign. Hey, Doc, it's a black law against the spread of ignorance. So what happened was, then people retreated from Willie Lynch being real to, well, he may not have been real, but what was done to us is authentic. I said, but even that's not true. It's the 20th century that had the most negative impact on black folks. I will not allow you to relegate African people to simply being victims. I said, y'all ain't read very much. Have you read Sterling Stuckey's Slave Culture? You know that the culture was still intact. So even if a mother or a father or children was sold off, it was about community and not individuals. So we were still able to maintain a sense of community. So the slave system, as brutal and vicious as it was, it did not destroy the family and the community fabric. And this is what folks don't understand because they ain't read much. So, but I'm glad to be able to really influence a lot of people to move away from this silly, outrageous myth, because even if some silly speech that's promoted out there was correct, even if it was legitimate, and it certainly is not, no one's found the original so-called letter because it doesn't exist. It was made up. But the bottom line is it doesn't give anybody anything to do other than be a perpetual victim. What are you going to do? Okay, so now you've woken up, you got your ass handed to you on a platter. Now what are you going to do? Nothing other than just be a victim. We can look at Hurricane Katrina if people want to be shocked. They can look at all of the brutality that Black folks have faced over the years, the decades, and generation. If they want to be shocked in the action, we can look at Tulsa. We can look at any city in the country that where Black folks had to rise up and fight, struggle, shed blood just for basic minimal rights. And that continues to go on. So we certainly don't need some shocking Ripley's Believe It or Not document to quote unquote wake people's up. But it relegates Black folks to being the perpetual victim who can never be an advocate for their own freedom and liberation. So it's a very outrageous document, and I'm glad that many folks have taken my work and have used it to join our campaign against the spread of ignorance.
Yeah, and the worst part of that is that it puts you in the position of putting forward the worst argument that you possibly can about your status as a human being, that they took our culture away from us. You're a culturalist people. You understand? There's no such person in the history of humanity. There might be individuals who have really fallen into a pit, but even then they have culture. Clarence Thomas, as bad as he is, he comes out of Geechee culture. And the fact of the matter is, he's been made to feel, and he has internalized the idea of feeling ashamed of what he should be proud of. But the key point is, as you make the point, one of the best proofs of this, that the culture continued, is the strongest Africans were the enslaved Africans. And the next strongest were the ones right after slavery. Zora Neale Hurston, who is probably the foremost expert on African American culture, and that's one of my expertise, I know it's one of yours, because if you're a historian and you don't know your own people, but you know the ancient thing, you don't know nothing, like Cornel West. You know what I mean? He don't know nothing about Africa. He don't know nothing about African American people. You understand? So the key thing is that in the midnight of oppression, where you faced the worst kind of inhumane treatment, the most humane Africans we produced was during that midnight. Why? They were most African. And my wife makes this point constantly because it's true in the Caribbean, it's true in South America, it's true wherever we are. So when you come out of enslavement, at least they had some land in the Caribbean. We only had each other. How did we survive? We survived off of humanism, caring for each other. Cardinal principle of our culture. You make the point that our families were intact. Yes, in enslavement, they would break up families, we would reform them. And the extended family community was the main thing that bonded us when, as some enslaved would say, I didn't know father, mother, sister, brother. You understand? But I's loved and I's all right. You know what I mean? Loved. And the one thing that will mess us up is if we don't get love. And we got a few people like that. Mike Tyson, that was his problem. Wasn't his fault. He didn't get no love. He's doing the best he can with it right now. I take my hat off to him. You know what I mean? But that's rare in the Black community. We got more of that now with drugs, breaking up families. More damage has been done to the Black psyche since '68 than during the enslavement process because of the breakup of institutions. But still, we're strong. And as the sister said, still we rise. You know what I mean? So that whole myth and the fact that some of our leaders could fall for it and then run around and propagandize it is telling you they hadn't looked in a book. And if you don't read, You can't lead. You'll be misleading and people will be following you right off the hill, right into whatever you fall into. So, yeah, that was a very important contribution. And I think, well, I'm going to give you the title. People have read it, but I want to dip right into this other thing and then we get into the other. So, the topic for today is a conversation with this brother here, Manu Ampim, on researching and writing African history. So, that's the overall topic. And since you got into the false narrative of our history, and this is the most false of all, you know what I mean? That they took our culture. First of all, think about this. We have the longest lived culture in the history of the world. We're the first people in the world, at least 149,000 years. And that's embedded in all African civilizations. The African that walked onto the plantation had so much culture in him and her. You wanted to erase it, it's just about impossible. And it's a culture that's a lived culture. It's not something in a book, even though it's in a book, in the case of Kemet and those that wrote. But the books of the masters in the oral civilizations, it was passed on from word to mouth, from, grandfather, master to, grandchild to son and so forth. And so that's what they carried in the plantation. They were going up against a recent culture. And it was a culture of greed and oppression and inhumanity. And this culture would stand strong. It does to this day, even if we aren't aware of it. I don't know how many of you watched the show that we did with Davey D on hip hop. Davey D made two comments when he started, and he's one of the masters on hip hop. He talked about hip hop being a culture, and then he stated what was right, that it was an expression of African American culture, because hip hop is not a culture, it's an art form. It's an expression of African American culture. But if you listen to that interview, Davey D was going into the depths of where it came from. He started with the spirit. And that's what the African carried. His biggest weapon on the plantation was the spirit, which is God, as they would say in the church, God. And you couldn't tell him, because he carried that power within him, and then all the knowledge that comes out of this history. So this is the jive. So again, those of you that tuned in late, you need to get on the show on time. You know what I mean? I know that we're on clocks now, and Africans didn't have clocks, but we've been talking about the myth of Willie Lynch, and this is the brother that killed the myth. And those of you that want to say it was done anyway, you don't know what you're talking about. So what I want to do first, because the topic is on, with Manu, on researching and writing African history, I want to just first of all get into a general discussion with you, because we're going to focus on his book, African Civilizations, Revised Edition, A History of African Civilization. We'll get into that in a minute. I wanted to discuss with you the importance of African history. Why is it important? And that's also African American. But why is it important for our people? How does it help us in our lives?
Well, I appreciate it. That's always a critical question that has to be addressed and answered. And that's a critical question that people ask all the time. And clearly, because people recognize we have issues wherever we might live in the U.S. or elsewhere, and people want to know, well, why are you focusing on Africa? Well, because as the great Kwame Ture would always tell us, is that if you start your history in slavery, the best you can be is a good slave. So for us, we have to embrace our traditional culture and foundation. And let's face it, Africans have worked out problems that we're still dealing with and trying to overcome now. And so whenever a group of people such as us are in the quicksand and quagmire that we're in, it's either one or two reasons for that. Either we never had a way, and that we've always been second-class citizens, enslaved people, and depended on somebody else for food, shelter, clothing, education, transportation, healthcare. And either it's always been that way, nothing new, and we just should accept our fate and then maybe try to do something that we've never done before, which is become free and independent. Or the alternative is that we have a way and we lost our way. Clearly, that's what happened to us. We had a way and we lost our way. So we can't, as Frantz Fanon would say, we can't try to catch up with the decadence of Europe or Euro-American. We can embrace our own way and our own tradition. So Africa provides solutions for us. So we're not looking to go back to African traditional culture and, let's say, build pyramids in New York or California or any other place. But it's not about building structures in that sense. It's about taking the principles and practices that allowed Africans to not only build for eternity, but to create models of a just society. So we have those examples. They still exist among the small statured people. So why would any intelligent people try to invent something and create solutions when we have a clear pathway? And these are still exhibited among the traditional cultures that practice that practice sharing and caring and egalitarian cultures with a strict rule system that is about governing the community. And when I'm in the field, people are very clear about that. When I was in South Sudan just some months ago, I met with 11 Dinka elders, and they were very clear about things that they don't like, they don't respect, and they were reflective. They indicated that there were some things in their tradition that they could adjust that maybe is not the best, but when it came to values, they were very clear that there's a price to pay if anybody engages in conduct which disrespects families and the community. And if we had that kind of system, we'd be much better off because we have people that can run around, do what they want, when they want, the way they want to do it. But if we embrace an African traditional practice, we would not have these rogue folks running around jeopardizing the safety and welfare of everybody in the community. And one other thing I would say is, so we want to take principles and practices that have stood this test of time, but also I remember in the 80s and 90s where the rites of passage programs had proliferated all over the U.S., cities all over the country. You had folks that were creating the rites of passage programs to initiate the women would help initiate young girls into womanhood, and then the men would initiate young boys into manhood. It wasn't some group of scholars, some think tank to try to figure this out. No, it was a looking at and understanding and embracing of African traditional culture, where we have a system of initiation from birth to death and beyond. So the rite of birth, very significant, where people are given names that are linked to their destiny. But the second rite, the rite of becoming an adult, that's a part of the African traditional initiation system. And so there were practitioners from our communities who understood that in their travels to Africa, their studies about Africa, and applied that to our communities in the U.S. So we made progress in not only embracing African values and looking to bring up young folks, but it was it had a lot of success. The only problem is that folks didn't understand that's not the only right. There's 5 rights. There's a right of birth, and they were dealing with the second right, the right of becoming an adult. But there's also the right of marriage, the right of becoming an elder, because there's a fundamental difference between an elder and an older person. They're different. The elder is the one who's respected, who's given deference. An older person just happens to live longer than somebody else, but they could be a drunkard, a scoundrel, a liar, someone with bad character. We give them some respect as being older, but they don't deserve and they never get the deference of an elder. And then the 5th right is the right of becoming an ancestor. So the respected elder becomes an ancestor. The older person with bad character just becomes a dead relative that we typically forget. But this is a system that maybe we didn't understand all 5 rights, but at least folks understood the second right of becoming an adult. And this was very, very significant for us to try to deal with the problems in the community and to help build and develop the community. So it's so many reasons why we need to understand African value system, African practices, and African societies, and all of this nonsense about women. The oldest profession among women is prostitution. I tell people to shh. They should be quiet with this misinformation. It's nothing to do with facts. Please join me in the law against the spread of ignorance, because women have had the highest status in traditional African culture and society.
There were no prostitutes in ancient and traditional Africa, none.
None at all. They don't even
Zero.
have a word for it. No practice, no word for it, no description because it didn't exist. So these are just some reasons why Africa becomes very important for us to embrace, to understand, and to apply those principles and practices because we got a lot of work to do to deal with the deep seated problems that we have in our community. And we can't try to deal with the nonsense and the outrageous conduct and behavior and value system of Europe or white America. That's not any solution to us. So Africa is our best bet to be free from the kind of ongoing problems that we face here in the U.S. and beyond. It's a global issue. So one last point, but this is why, and you all did this doc at San Francisco State, but this is why it's important for us to know that when we say Africana studies, this is important because we're not just dealing with Africa, but Black people around the world. Is Africa and the diaspora. So I don't just say African studies because that means we're only dealing with the continent, or African American studies mean we're only dealing with Black folks in the U.S. So Africana studies is the basis for our global view and perspective. And it, in the old days, people would say Pan African studies, which is fine. But today we typically say Africana studies because we want to look at the African traditional system and how it can help us to solve our problems. And to just deal with as some people do, the diaspora or the dispersal since slavery. That's not good enough. We have to look at traditional values and solutions are there. And I can mention a lot of examples, not just the Dinka, but when I'm in the field in Ethiopia, those groups in the Omo Valley practicing their traditional system. And it's amazing how they go about that, regardless of what anybody thinks about it.
Yeah, those are very good points. That if you don't have a view of yourself beyond your oppression, then you're likely to reproduce it. And if you understand, we're the world's first people. We give birth. God gave us the honor of being the first human beings. And then we give birth to the world's first civilizations, the most just, the most creative on the planet. So if you understand that and it's ingrained in you, then you're going to want to aspire to that. And so one of the things that's going to encourage you to be is creative. Another proof that the African in America, and this is true of enslaved Africans everywhere, but I'm going to give the example of the African American in this particular case, who underwent the most serious attempt by enslavers to strip us of culture because of our numbers, and this being a successful settler colony, and we not being the 97% in the country as they were in the Caribbean, or 50 or 60% in Brazil and 70 or 80% in Cuba. But the point is, in spite of that, our culture persisted. And so we come out with an ethos. All African people have their own special ethos. They're not all the same. It's the way you carry yourself in the world. So the ethos of the Kemite is Ma'at. It's very clear. I mean, that drives it, And why? Because they constructed a civilization and they wanted it to be just. That was the basis. Or if you go to the Yoruba, it's Ori. Why? Because the Yoruba culture, like many other African cultures, has a deep knowledge of beginnings, spiritual beginnings. How did you begin in heaven? How did you come to earth? You reached a compact in heaven. It's your Ori, it's your destiny. All people who experience life after death experiences come back saying that they see people in heaven picking their destiny. Oh, it's wrong that God told me to do this. I made the decision in the presence of God, which also means not only can your culture not be wiped out, but that you are the powerhouse at every level. You actually picked your parents. That's what you think you didn't do. That's a common statement of, I didn't pick my mother. The day before I met my wife, this was 2005, I'm in the United Kingdom, and I had spoke at the African Liberation Day, and then I had a spiritual session the night before with a number of people. So one of the sisters that was with me was driving me to meet Pam, which is my future wife. And she picked it up too. As soon as I saw her, she said, uh-oh. And so she had a memory of her past life. where she picked her destiny in heaven. And so did her sister. And then she said, but I picked the wrong mother. I said, no, you didn't. You picked an imperfect mother. That's why you picked her. So you could learn something. You know what I mean? So African civilizations are the foundation for world civilization. And it is the basis for the highest achievement that humanity has made. If you want to deal with classical civilization, it's Kemet, cities, highly structured societies. The greatest civilization is the Twa, the most just and most creative. And by the way, the founders of Kemet are Anu, Twa, Anu. You hear me? Asar was Anu, little black people. You hear me? So yeah, that's the first thing. Because if you know the greatness of what you've achieved, then you have a greater sense of what you can do now. And you have a greater playbook to draw from in life. Because the other thing I say about history, the role of history is to make the past serve the present. And that's basically what you were saying. Taken out of the history, those things that are most relevant for today. And for a people, African people who have been disrupted by colonialism and slavery to a degree that no other people on the planet have, other than Native Americans who have faced just plain ass genocide. And we have too, but not on that level. So for us, as the Chinwe Achebe thing says, with colonialism, things fall apart. With slavery, things fall apart. So we got to put things back together. But what doesn't fall apart are the core elements of your culture that persist. There's holes in it because of colonialism, because of slavery, because we develop other consciousness. And it's usually a small group of blacks who see themselves through the eyes of others. The masses of blacks don't see themselves through the eyes of others. Black people have been historically in this country 97%ers. We usually go 97% in one direction. And so the best rule, if you want to know where to go where the masses of black people are going. If you ain't got no clue, follow that, because they're usually going to be right. 97% of black men marry black women. Now it's 86% of brothers and 92% of sisters. That's still good. You know what I mean? So that means there's some wisdom. Miles Davis, as messed up as he could be on some levels, he said, I always married a black woman and she ended up being just like my mother. And I don't know why. Yeah, you know why. You know what I mean? You could say you don't know why. So the point is, that's your culture in you. The other thing is, I'd say this, and this goes again to killing the Willie Lynch syndrome, and it also answers a question that was raised up here on this question thing. The core elements of African culture have continued in all African civilizations in the diaspora. So the Caribbean, South America, here. One of the two core things, there's a lot of core things, I just give two. One is the core of spirit. Spirit was what empowered us. And if you see on the plantation, the way in which we didn't take on Christianity, that's a myth of Willie Lynch, you know? They waved a wand, we became Christians. No, they waved a wand and we said, hell no, they're devils. That's what we said. And we had diviners who we were going to. We had priests who we were going to. And we would have hush harbors where we'd stick our head under a bucket to draw down the spirit. So when you have the Pentecostal church that revives itself in Los Angeles, what are they doing? They're putting a bucket over their head to bring back the spirit. Spirit is at the foundation of our culture. If you lose a sense of spirit, you lose a connection to God. Now, there's a question about, so what's the examples of how we've carried it on here? I've told you before, and I've told this the viewers here, but some are new. I interviewed John Henry Clarke for the last 8 months of his life on the masters in his life. John Henry Clarke's university was the University of Masters. He didn't go to no college. He went under the tutelage of the best people they had at that time, Arthur Schomburg, Willis Huggins, and others. And what he did is he apprenticed under them. And as a result, he said the advantage of that was that he didn't have to unlearn stuff like some of our scholars who went, say, to Harvard, they had to spend 30 years unlearning Harvard. Yeah, he didn't have to unlearn that. But the point is, John didn't know that that was a continuation of the African apprenticeship system. He knew that it was a respect for elders, but he didn't know that. And so how have we done that? So like you're saying, there are rites of passage, there are many more. The educational system of Africa, whether it was Per Ankh and the House of Life, the great University of Kemet, or the secret societies of Africa, the apprenticeship system was like the key system for mastery, and it had levels and it had degrees. I've gone through that system. And most of our people who are at the level of mastery, they have gone through that system. And so today, that's what we have to popularize. The book I'm coming up with will be dealing with that on 7th. So, you know, the point is, we have continued in our culture African traditions and practices, and they've kept us alive. And the extended family community was a big one. Drugs has weakened it. We got to revitalize it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So these are so history is a weapon. It's a knife. You're supposed to use it for your liberation of your mind, your spirit, your body. Now let's get into your newly released book, revised book, A History of African Civilization, revised edition. And why don't you tell us about the newly released revised edition of your book and give us some summary of it and why you found it necessary to make revisions.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I first, the History of African Civilizations, first it was to have materials for students for a class I teach at Contra Costa College here in Northern California. And, you know, there's very little material to draw from. But since I've been in the field doing primary research for more than 3 decades, I draw from my own material, but I recognize that giving handouts and showing slides and things like that were not really user friendly. So initially I created a reader for the class, but why make it just for the classroom when I can make it available to the community? So I created a reader and eventually published the first edition. And recognized, you know, the first edition, I had a time limit to get it done. So it was just a fraction of what I actually know and what I teach. And so I wanted to update that from 2019, 4 years ago, to have updated text because things have changed in the California community college system. There's some other campuses, and then things have also reversed. So we used to have colleges that have African history as a requirement. They don't have that anymore. So I needed to update those numbers. Also add some sections that I didn't really get an opportunity to put in that were missing, for example, and then adding some user-friendly parts to the text, such as index, expanding the glossary, adding new sections like a section on the great Carter G. Woodson that needed to be in there, and also other areas that I teach about but didn't put in the first volume, like from Kemet, we get the word ultimately chemistry. And there are people who are chemists, they teach chemistry, they don't even know the etymology or the history of their own discipline. So I wanted to make sure that me teaching that is not just confined to the classroom, but that I put it in the text as well. So we have a section on the origin of the word chemistry or the etymology, the study of that term. And then just to add more details to some of the sections. Like, for example, one of the most important scholars and historians in the 20th century is Carter G. Woodson. And there's been materials written, biographies written on the great Carter G. Woodson and the Black history movement. But Doc, I've not seen or even heard when I've gone to scholarly conferences anything about Woodson's work on African civilizations. It's amazing. Even the African Heritage Month themes in February, they are almost always, even by his organization, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH, they set the theme every year, and they have the White House events, they set the national theme, and they've never have had a theme since the passing of Woodson in 1950, 3/4 of a century ago. There's never been a theme, never been a focus on Africa, or at least on Africa and the Black experience in the U.S. has been the U.S. only. So this is really a misrepresentation of the work of Woodson during his lifetime, because Woodson focused on African civilizations. His last two books were on Africa. And in fact, like for example, I have a section here on Woodson that I added in, but I wanted to make sure that, for example, in 1936, Woodson wrote the African Background Outline. That was in 1936. And then his last book, 1939, he wrote African Heroes and Heroines. The last two books that this scholar wrote, over a dozen books total, those are the last two books. And matter of fact, the last article series that Woodson wrote, it was a three-part series that he simply entitled Egypt. It was in 1949 and 50. And so that's what his focus was. When he's dealing with that we've been miseducated and we need to embrace the African aspect of our historical experience, he's producing that in his scholarship, in his books, in his essays, but also even if people look at the Journal of Negro History, when the first issue, it's focused on Africa. Yes, the very first issue in 1916, you have articles on Africa, focus on Africa, book reviews on Africa, and then the Negro History Bulletin, which he edited and published in 1939. This was a focus on teachers. He wanted to make sure that teachers had the ammunition, the ammo to be able to teach effectively in the classroom and give students and parents the armor and artillery to protect ourselves from the propagandists who were arguing that Black people had no worth, no history, and to lynch and kill Black folks was perfectly fine because they came from a background of nothingness. Woodson challenged this. So he had a complete apparatus that he published through Associated Publishers, his own publishing house, with his books, with the Journal of Negro History, with the Negro History Bulletin. And the first issue, again, in the Negro History Bulletin is a focus on Africa, African achievements. You see issues, articles like that in these issues. And Woodson was not only an editor, but he was able to pull a group of writers to write about African themes. Where is this in the scholarship? It doesn't exist. You have some of the most accomplished historians that focus on the Black experience in the U.S. They are part of Woodson's organization, nothing on Africa. So I recognize that I had to include that in my revised edition to make sure that it's more of what I know and more of what I'm teaching to make this available to the public. And if you don't mind, Doc, I'll see if I can just share my screen to show. If I can, let's see, share. Let me see if I can just at least show people the book. I'm not.
Your father's name is Kofi, isn't it?
Yeah, from Kofi Ampim.
Yes. Yeah, he's on the bottom here looking in.
Okay, all right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, let me see if
your spirit is speaking right now.
Share. Yeah, my father, who's a great father and supporter, he texted me to make sure I was on your show this morning. I said, yes, absolutely. So I hope I'm sharing this. If so, this is a copy of my book, A History of African Civilizations. And this is the great Taharka, who's the greatest builder in the history of ancient Kush. So Kush is the oldest of the classical African civilizations. So I wanted to make sure that, I continue to get the word out about Kush, which was based in current day Sudan, but also it's Kush with a broader understanding of Kush causes me to go out in the field in South Sudan to continue my field work. So I wanted to make sure that, I had, as I said, updates in the text and also to get it out more widely. So this is actually Taharka. And also, this is here's the entire cover of Taharka on the front, and then some background, because what I did with the first text, and I wanted to clarify it and make it clear of the use of the textbook, because it came out of my work in the field and I implemented and presented that in the classroom. But I also wanted to make sure that not only is this book for the classroom at the high school level and the college level, but as it is for the public, the general public as well. So it's not just a textbook, but it's a book for the community, for the general public, that also it can be and should be used in the classroom. So there were many things that I wanted to accomplish with this book. So I'm happy with it, and I'll continue with other publications. But this is just off the press, and I just want to say that I wanted to make sure that Kushology is also front and center and put out there, that the study of ancient Kush as the first of the classical African civilizations. I actually coined the term Kushology. People know about Egyptology, they hear about Nubiology, and some of us are focused on Kemetology, the study of ancient Kemet, but people had not heard Kushology. I've created this term to really define the fact that there must be an ongoing systematic focus on ancient Kush and the foundation that it laid for high level Nile Valley civilization. So these are just some of the things that I focused on in this book, which is just off the press. And so it's published by us, by Advancing the Research. I wanted to make sure that we kept distribution control of the product and didn't really have to rely on others. So that's some of the reasons for the second volume.
So where can people purchase this?
Yeah, people can go to advancingtheresearch.org and then publish the book, advancingtheresearch.org, and publish it directly. Of course, I'm on social media. People can go and find me, Manu Ampim, at Gmail as well. You can email me directly and purchase the book. I'm sure somebody's thinking, well, what about Amazon? Yeah, you can get it at Amazon, but keep in mind that for Black publishers, for the Black publishing world, to say Amazon, as one Black bookstore owner told me, that's like cussing at somebody. That's like a bad word to talk about Amazon.
Out of business.
Yes, exactly. So why give them a cut of the work that I'm doing? So we publish our own work. Yeah, you can get it through Amazon, but guess what? They get their cut, and you're perfectly fine to do that. But guess what? I won't sign it. I'm not going to sign it if you purchase it through Amazon, but you can find it there. But go to advancingtheresearch.org and find it, and then you'll be able to find it in some of your local bookstores as well. But you can always get it directly from us, Advancing the Research.
Yeah, I do my own publishing, hire someone to edit, distribution. And so I found recently that Amazon's carrying some of my books. I ain't sending none of them to them. And you know what? They've jacked the price up. And that's because, and I think I know the guy, and if he pulled this, I'm not going to let him distribute my books anymore. If he pulled this, and I'm pretty sure he's the only one that could have. And so he probably jacked the price up so he can make more money. You know what I mean? I'm not out to rip my people off, but most important, Amazon has put a lot of bookstores, Black and white, out of business.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Publishers and everything else. So you're absolutely right. Go to the source or don't go, but don't be supporting your oppressor. You
Absolutely. Know what I mean? And Doc, that's a great point, because I was curious and I wanted to know what happened to Borders, because, brick and mortar bookstores have been declining, including Black bookstores like Liberation Books in New York is gone now. Essewan in LA is gone. So Marcus Books in San Francisco is gone. So Marcus Books in Oakland is the oldest Black bookstore in the country. And I was talking with Blanche about just some of the challenges with maintaining its independence. And then as an author, you're right. We want to make sure that we get our work out and that we control the distribution. But I wanted to know about Borders and what Borders did. Borders was huge. I mean, people know about Barnes and Nobles, but Borders was huge. But what Borders did is that they outsourced their online component to Amazon, which already had a base. And Borders, was pretty much, they had the bookstore and not so much online orders. So they outsourced this component of their company to Amazon, their list of customers. They outsourced the distribution, and Amazon took their customers. So Borders was never able to shift to online sales. They were stuck, even though the industry was changing, the economy was changing. Borders was stuck with, just a physical building, and they could not make the transition. And a huge company like that went under. And Amazon is cutthroat too, because if you
Oh yeah.
you can't even talk to somebody if a problem comes up. What they'll do is they will lock up your account, and after they lock the account up, then you can maybe try to talk to somebody about resolving a petty issue, a small issue, an issue that shouldn't even really be that much to it if you're dealing with a human being. But to them, it's just bottom line business, and that's it. So it does serve a purpose, and we do distribute through Amazon to broaden the market. But we want people to also understand that being independent means that we have to we have to approach things differently and make sure we control the economics in our own community, because it's going to help everybody. And then also it keeps the cost down. Because if you got to pay Amazon, you got to jack the prices up. They charge a lot of money just for an ebook. Really? Yes, they charge a lot of money that you can't make an ebook as probably as inexpensive at it as it should be, because you would not make a dime, because Amazon is going to get their cut. So yeah, there's a time and place, and there's a space for Amazon, but people should recognize that that's secondary. You can deal with them if you can't get it in, well, that's tertiary. Yeah. If you can't get it from the publisher directly or the local bookstore, then look for Amazon, but don't make them first. And we never have, because there's nothing more crucial and critical than self-publishing. We were talking about my Willie Lynch book that was published by Black Classic Press, but other than that, we've published our own books directly, and there's advantages to that. We can, you know what, Doc is in the tradition of Carter G. Woodson, and he was a stickler. He had associated publishers and made a big deal. He said that when you publish the truth, that's self-defense. That's what he called it. It's self-defense when you publish the truth. So he did not allow white bigots and racists and white arrogant white folks to have editorial control of his work. So it's really an affront today that his organization gave up the rights to distribute the journal. And now it's not the Journal of Negro History, Journal of African American History, which is the largest, most influential journal dealing with Black people in the U.S. They've given up the independence to the University of Chicago. That's outrageous. That's not in the tradition of Woodson. So they've given that up, but they've also given up his focus on Africa. And I wanted to make sure that I add that back into the text and also maintain independence. Yeah, I mean, there's some big companies out there, and sometimes it might be okay to partner with them, but to be relying only on that is not a community, independent, community-oriented focus. I'll give one other example too about how sometimes it makes sense to work with big companies, but you should also have your own independent publishing. Is that I was contacted by the Africa director, director of the Africa desk, company called Routledge. Routledge is one of the largest academic distributors of publications in the world. And the lady contacted me because she liked the way I laid out a history of African civilizations and invited me to edit a major handbook on African civilizations and to bring together scholars from different parts of the world to write important essays on African, pre-colonial African civilizations. And I said, that's great. I would love to do that. And the thing is that it would be a 500-page book. And what it would do is set the agenda for how we should look at traditional African civilizations for the next 5 to 10 years, because it will be leading scholars in different areas that I can help pull together to aid and support the firsthand research I've been doing. So the history of African civilization is just a small part of the overall work that I'm doing and will do to get the word out. But I am happy that I've gotten this book out and it's available now to the public.
Yeah, it's very important to really stress this, that the publishing industry in this country that's white owned, you don't even know who is really doing the publishing, because the publishing can be CIA. For example, the CIA puts out a lot of books and the publishers sometimes don't even know it's CIA, that there's a range of information that they will allow publishers, and beyond that, they won't allow it. So if you're being published by a major publisher, you're lucky if you're Black, if you're able to put your own stuff out, because publishers, number one, they will have themes, and they will often give writers themes to write. and then they'll edit them based on whether or not they conform to what they want put out there. So the only way you're going to get undiluted truth is if you put your own stuff out. Your own stuff, it will cost you, but you're getting the undiluted truth out there. So that is really key. And in the case of, you were giving the example of Carter G. Woodson. We're going to go into him in a minute in more detail. But the example you gave of his book on African history outline. Almost everybody that knows Carter G. Woodson has read Miseducation of the Negro. Hardly anybody's read African history outline. That's the follow-up to Miseducation of the Negro. That was Carter G. Woodson's version of what real African education should be at that time. That's what he had, the amount of information he had then at that time. What's interesting about that book is one page of that book is information on African history and culture. And by the way, on African American, because he has some of the best information on secret societies among Africans in America. Carter G. Woodson understood African American culture as well as African culture, and he was close to it. His ancestors had been enslaved, and he himself had been a coal miner. And so he had come out of grassroots communities and stuff. So he knew stuff about our history and culture, the psychological makeup and everything else. So the book African History Outline is a must read, but hardly anybody's read it. Hardly anybody's read it. You need to read it. And then he had a whole series of books on African history. He paralleled J. Rogers in terms of introducing you to themes on African history, and then books on children. We're going to go into that in a minute. But the key point is, if you want to get the undiluted truth, go to the source. And usually it's coming from Black people put their own stuff out. For example, Theophilo Obenga's book on philosophy during the Pharaonic period. That book was translated from French into English by Armand, the author of 2000 Seasons. And I saw him bring the final edited copy to Theophilo Obenga when we were in Senegal as part of an African Scholars Conference in 2004. And so, and then it's published. But the point is, it was published through the eyes of an African who sees things right. And of course, Obenga wasn't going to prove it unless it was right. Mm-hmm. So again, you got to go to sources, and sources are extremely important. Now, I know you as a researcher are a stickler for primary research. So why don't you explain to people what you mean by primary research and why you have placed a special emphasis on that?
I appreciate that question, Doc. I have a whole section actually in the introduction on primary or firsthand research. Firsthand research is really it's firsthand investigation when we go directly to the sources, to the sites and sources. So it's not secondhand. It's not reading what someone else had to say. It's not hearing information at a lecture or conference and then taking that and using it. Is going directly to the original evidence. And primary research is the highest level of research and investigation. And it's nothing more valuable and powerful than that. And I started my journey on doing the firsthand investigation. I got the training in grad school at Morgan State University when I was there in grad school. And I went out in the field in 1989 and 1990. I moved to England. I stayed and lived there for a year. And I was applying what I was learning in school of how to do firsthand research in museums, institutes, and libraries. And as I lived in England in 89 and 90, I went to 11 European countries, went to all of the institutions that had stolen African artifacts. So I went to East Germany and West Germany. Now they're one Germany. Austria, Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden. And that gave me a firm foundation of looking at original African artifacts and documents, and so forth, but they were out of context because these were in Europe. So then I finally went to Kemet or Egypt in 1990 to start doing original firsthand research there at pyramids, temples, tombs, ancient residential sites, and museums in Kemet. And so this was a foundation of me doing the firsthand or primary research. And what was interesting is that much of what I had heard or learned, I recognized it was either incorrect or it was just a small part of a much larger story. And spending detailed time in the field, I learned so much as I went to over 40 different sites my first visit, and then I began to begin to publish after that because I recognized that the people in the community needed to know what I was seeing. So I got my camera out. I took a lot of photographs, and one of the things that because I started off to do the research to learn about African high culture and civilization and contributions to the world, and that I was documenting that, I also recognized that modern day conspirators, people who were de-Africanizing artifacts. I'm talking about modern Egyptologists, modern archaeologists, museum curators, museum officials who were doctoring up and changing the appearance of statues and reliefs after discovery, like systematically erasing the paint so you wouldn't see the dark paint representing the skin tone, reshaping noses and lips. And you can only know that from doing the work in the at the site, because a lot of, even if you have photographs taken by others or museum catalogs, they don't zoom in on what I was seeing. And I recognize the power of primary research as a tool and a weapon of self-defense, but also to go on the offense and take it to those that distort the history. So firsthand research is the most effective way to go on the inside. And so I started to learn Africa from an inside and African cultural traditions and civilization from an inside perspective rather than from the outside, because you'll never get the full story unless you're really doing the firsthand work. And of course, it could be out in the field, as I was in museum institutes or whatever field someone's working on, going out, interviewing people, being among people with rituals, ceremonies, learning the oral history. That's all the significance and the essence of firsthand research. And people know it instinctively, but when it comes to history, they don't really apply it. Like, for example, even on a petty level, when somebody's young and people are in middle school and they hear, or high school, they hear that somebody was talking about them, talking crazy, and somebody else comes to tell them that what somebody said. So then for the person, they get upset. What do they almost do? They almost always go directly to the person and said, you were saying what? That's doing firsthand research to find out if those statements were made. So people know instinctively to go to the source, but they only understand it in that kind of petty manner and not when it comes to research. And now with the emergence of the internet and electronic media, it's bad for a lot of people because they don't learn the research tools and techniques that we learn. Like, I know the library inside out. I know call numbers. I started to see it because everything dealing with Africa starts with a D in the library, a DT. So I would always go to the D section in every library. I didn't have to take a class to know that. I knew because of the 1,000 hours that I spent in the libraries. So I know how to go to the library. And what you mentioned, the great Theophilo Benga, when he was at your place, beginning in 1999, as you know, I would come by every Sunday, pick up Obinga, and we would spend 13 straight hours at the library finding publications from tombs, temples, and things like that every week. And so I recognize the significance of that, the power of it, and it's just not enough people who go to the sources to learn from an inside perspective, but that's what gives us the greatest insight. So I had to have a section on primary research in the book, distinguish that from secondhand research and then tertiary, because when you get to tertiary or levels removed from the original source, it is nothing but historical hearsay. And that's why most people, they don't have details. They don't focus on historical context of when and where. What they say these days, is that back in the day, in Africa, what do you mean back in the day? Whose day? What day? That's not serious scholarship. You mean back in the day. You need to be very specific, when and where. So this is what I wanted to focus on in the book, but it's what I've been doing for quite some time. And I was pleased earlier this year, I did a 3-part seminar on the fundamentals of primary research. And it was a very, very good, and I would say even large turnout from people in the community who wanted to learn exactly what are the fundamental elements of primary research in the field of Africana studies. So that's something I'm clearly not the first to do primary research, but I would say that I promoted it as much as anybody, in the country, and kind of made it more of a term that people describe, discuss, and understand. And so that's what's been my forte, because I recognize there's no way to gain the kind of insight that we need to be able to look at our issues, solve them, and take African culture and contributions and apply them unless we're getting the firsthand, up-to-date information. And I cannot wait, really, to publish more of my work from being out in the field doing the firsthand research.
Now, the zoo has a question here. Dr. Ampim, how are you empowering African people with the skill of research?
Well, as I mentioned, two things. One is I have a primary research methodology course that I teach. It's a 7-step course where I take the tools and techniques that I know as a firsthand researcher, and someone can sign up for the course on their own. It's a home study course. And then also I decided earlier this year to have an open class session for people who may not sign up for the 7-step course through the website advancingtheresearch.org, but can have the live sessions, which we did earlier this year. So those are ways that my skills are made available to the community to learn. And a lot of professionals took the seminar, but also in the book explaining exactly what is firsthand research methods. And everything I do, there's always a focus on original firsthand work. So if you go to my YouTube channel, for example, you'll see videos where I've done and presented firsthand research, firsthand evidence, and most importantly, it's the methodology. This is why I can look at a lot of our great scholars and see what contributions they made, and on the other hand, what is other work to be done to use their work as a springboard to do additional work. Like, for example, Carter G. Woodson, tremendous insight. His focus on Africa needs to be promoted, but he didn't do field work in Africa. So this is where I'm contributing to do field work to add to the great work that he did, for example. So thank you for the question. And, but my work is pretty much available on firsthand research methods and how to apply it. So thank you very much.
This is a brother who is into detail, and it better be just right. And that's right, because then that's where the truth comes from. Our brother Quadro Dwayne Dieterville, he confirms that. He said, I took Professor Ampim's private workshops on primary research many years ago, and they were excellent.
Yes, and Brother Dwayne, I'm sorry, Brother Quadro changed his name, and his wife, Sister Adiba. As a matter of fact, she encouraged him because he took the first part, the basic level, and then I had the intermediate level, and she encouraged him, you need to take that intermediate level. So yeah, so Brother Quadro and others, they know that I've been teaching the primary research course and courses now for decades, and I do remember the brother being a solid member of those sessions decades ago.
Yeah, research is, for me, very important, both as a warrior and a scholar. I've never lost any battles, and one thing is I research my enemy. So in fact, that was my best research came out of that, and that's what really got my scholarship straight. But the other part is researching our people, knowing our people. But also, good research has also an intuitive realm. And so I'm a strategist. As a warrior, you got to know your enemy's weakness. You hit him in his weakness. You don't hit him in his strength. Though sometimes that's good too, but not too often. And part of it is instinctive. If you got the gift, you know where they're weak, then you go research it, and you'll find out a whole lot more. And so when you hit the battlefield, they've already lost. That's the whole idea. You know what I mean? But don't go on what somebody told you or what they call assumptions, ASS. You don't think on that. You know what I mean? And that's where the biggest mistakes are made by everybody. We all make them. We assume. our best scholars, when they make mistakes, it's usually on an assumption. You know what I mean? So yeah, this is extremely important. What I wanted to do now is take this another space at another place, and then I want to get your reaction to this. And this is another realm of primary sources, but this is the realm of African primary sources. And so Africans have embedded in their educational systems ancient and traditional, and those of us who stick to it modern, because if you're really doing this, you piped into this, and when I'm explaining, I've been into this realm. And this is a realm that Western education is suspicious of and has no way of teaching, even though they have Westerners who are skilled in this. But they didn't get their skill through their education. It came from another realm. And so this is the primary source. And so I'm going to start off with it this way. And see, the average African, some have been brainwashed now away from this, but the average African knows this. And by the way, I want to preface this with the statement that Theophile Obenga said about Sheikh Anta Diop. It was a matter of fact, he said. He didn't have a large library. He said most of his research was based on intuition. And he said he was usually accurate. Now, there's one time where he made a big mistake. I'm not going into that, but that was because he went on an assumption. But most of his stuff was intuitive. And he said, I don't know where that came from. That's what Obenga says. I don't know where that came from. Well, it came from African culture, but it also came from the Islamic system that the people from Senegal have that's been Africanized. And so that is basically at its base Africa. And so he read, but that wasn't the main thing. It was his intuition. So let me go to this and say this. I'm going to preface it this way. Primary source material is very important, and no question. And then I think there's primary civilizations that are very important because they're like first. So if you're dealing with, or any civilization, you want to study them. But first civilizations are really important because they're foundational. And so in the case of African civilizations, my view is that the Twa, being the world's first people, not studied as a civilization because they've been reduced to anthropology, they're at the foundation of all African civilizations and world civilizations. They come out of Africa. All people do. But the primary source in African primary source research in ancient and traditional African societies, those are societies way back, you can go 149,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, and earlier or later, prior to the intrusion of the European, and they continue after. The primary source is God. Now, this is a problem in the Western Academy because, first of all, your best Western historians are also philosophers, and they're philosophers like Hegel. They have taken anything spiritual completely out of it, but they will call God reason. They worship reason. They despiritualized. What anyone that is evolved knows is the lower mind, which can make mistakes. You know what I mean? So I just want to talk about this primary source, which is God. How does it work in ancient African systems? And we're always just looking at Kemet. That's a mistake. We need to look at Kemet. We need to look at other African civilizations. And we particularly need to look at African civilizations that are alive today and still passing on their systems, and particularly people who are transmitting them who have gone through them. So there's a great master in the Bambara system. His name is Hampati Ba, Hampateba. I apprenticed under Dr. Jacob Carruthers, one of my masters. In fact, this is his greatest work here, Medu Neter, in my opinion. It's his greatest work. Jake's stuff was always brief because Jake had the gift of brevity. I don't have that gift. You may have guessed that. He could boil stuff down in a few minutes. That was it. He told me when he did his master's thesis, it was so short that the person in charge of the committee refused to award him a master's. He had to revise it. Jake is very stubborn. Jake said no. Finally, the guy read it and approved it. But that's Jake, you know what I mean? So Jake was into this whole area, you know, in terms of knowledge and in terms of research. And this book, Medu Neter, is a primary work. And so he has a conception of the source of knowledge that is very consistent with the Bambara conception. He's using the Kemetic. But in the case of Hampati Ba, it was Jake. I would call Jake up and ask him, what should I read? And I called him once and he said, I don't know. And just, you know, the best answers are always, oh, by the way. When you get an oh, by the way, oh, that's a good one. You know what I mean? And said, oh, by the way, you should read the UNESCO series, Volume 1, Hampati Ba. I have all the UNESCO series. I went and read it. Hampati Ba was initiated in the traditional system. And he was the last among the masters in the Bambara system. Bambara Malian people, and they're akin to the Dogon. They live in the same region. And they put forward some great civilizations. As I pointed out before, Malcolm's great-great-grandfather was probably Bambara, a jar, you know. And they populate the region of Louisiana, among others. And they're warrior cultivators, warrior builders, and whatnot. They're warriors, all of them, you know. So Hampati Ba, who was initiated under this, but also trained under the French system, you know. But later, he came up under the traditional one first. He talks about the chain of transmission. And so for the Bambara people, the source of truth is based on the chain of transmission. And what do they mean? Where truth comes from. And so ultimately, it's the truth that is transmitted from God to human beings. And the first one would be the first ancestor. And so while the Kemites didn't use the word chain of transmission, whenever they talked about wisdom, they would go back to Asar, their first ancestor, who was the founder of along with Aset, the Pharaonic civilization. And according to astrophysics, I've traced the date period, and it's considerably earlier. I've done a couple of shows on this. You go watch them, you'll see them. Considerably earlier than dynastic Kemet, that dating. Historians make a big mistake in starting with dynastic Kemet, you know. But the key point is they go back. So they go back to the first ancestor. Why? Because this is the ancestor closest to God, but not just in time, but in quality, in terms of makeup, in terms of goodness, in terms of truth, and therefore in terms of wisdom. So in the chain of transmission, the Bambara say that Mangala, who is God, Mangala, and by the way, human beings are called Ma, which is telling you God is within you. And notice, minus one word, that's Ma'at, M-A-A. You hear me? That when Mangala created human beings, Mangala created beings, which they called the 21st of the powers that God could converse with. And the initiation period among the Bambara is 21 years. You know, when you reach 21, you then go through 21 years of initiation to master whatever your calling is, which is your gift, which is your purpose for being here, which is why you came here in the first place. And most of us will say, we don't know why we're here. And that is the biggest mistake you can make in life because it's embedded in you. It's in your wish. It's what you love most. Manu is doing what he loves most. You hear me? You can see it. And his father, I'm going to put him up on the screen when this is towards the end, Kofi. Kofi kind of got him on that path because I've known him. He's a community organizer. He's done a whole lot of stuff, but he's on his path. He's doing his thing. We were all put here to make our contribution to make life better on earth. And according to the Bombard, in communicating with man and woman's purpose is to be guardians of this planet. I'm sure the Kemites had the same idea, not just to live in harmony with the planet, but to be guardians. And the way the planet is messed up now, it's going to take some guardianship of unmessing the mess, you know? So then they go on to say that this wisdom that was passed to their first ancestors is then transmitted through a chain. And that chain are the masters who teach the initiates. And in the Dogon system, it's 4 degrees. I've talked about this on the show before. My book that I'm finishing is on this. We have 3 levels in our system, 3 levels of mastery. The Dogon have 4. I'm not going to go into that. But the key point is that it's the chain of transmission that is the source of wisdom, that is the source of knowledge. Now, Jacob Carruthers, Dr. Jake, he liked to call himself Jake from Chicago. In his book, Medu Neter, he talks about, because Medu Neter, Medunetcher, is God speech, speech that comes from God. Medu Nefer, Meduneffer, human speech, speech received from God that humans speak, that if it's spoken right, approximates, but is not the exact same as God's speech, but it comes from God. So this is what he says about the source of the meaning of Medu Neter. There are many meanings, but this is the first meaning. He says, well, let me read the whole thing. The proper designation of the deep thought of Kemet. Jake preferred deep thought to philosophy. And basically, he was taking this from the Dogon, who called it deep knowledge. I think he called it deep thought. The proper designation of the deep thought of Kemet are Medu Neter, God's speech, and Medu Nefer, good speech, the speech made by human beings. This term approximates the Greek term theology, divine speech, and logos, reason speech, rather than the more popular term philosophy. Well, that's a whole nother thing, but he's making the point that this is similar to what the Greeks were talking about, but it's not the same. According to Augustine, the term philosophy, love of wisdom, was first coined by Pythagoras, and he goes on. Now, I said, in the first place, the etymology of the word medu, pronounced M-E-D-E-W, medu, speech, means, and this is the key point, staff or cane, C-A-N-E, of authority. The staff of old age, the staff that the elder walks with. In other words, what Jake is saying is that the source of wisdom that comes from God, transmitted to human beings, first through elders, the staff of authority is symbolic of the cane of the elder. And so the elder is the source. So in African sources, you always go back to your elders, but you go back to the ancient elders, the first elders, or the ones who are primary. Now, this is the key point I want to make and then translate it in our reality. Now, what do you get when you go to this? Now, I really want to stress this. In African research, as we would call it, there are levels, or in African mastery, there are levels. And so the first level is the level of imitating masters. You learn the foundations of something through going through a master and becoming like them. My interview with John Henry Clark, most of the time was spent on the masters he imitated. You know what I mean? For example, or me, my first master was Garvey. I imitated. Second one was Malcolm X. I imitated him, right? It's like a child imitating their mother. It follows the same path of learning that a child does with the mother. That's what really African educational systems are based on. But at another level of the stars, that's a whole nother discussion. So the key point is that in the mastery system, there's a foundational level before you can get to this level that I'm talking about. And this level is mastering the foundation. So in the case of what Manu has been talking about, going to primary sources, for example, getting your facts right. And those facts have got to be based on truth. And then putting them together. And then there's levels of that. And then there's beyond the level of just getting the foundation together, because you can't do anything until you have the foundation, whether it's music, athletics, mathematics, science, whatever it is, you got to have the foundation. And if the foundation is weak, it's like a building, the building is going to collapse. And so that's, Manu is making the point. It's really bad that people are relying primarily on the ignornet, because I say there's an infonet, an ignornet, and an afronet. They're relying on the ignornet. And some people are going to make some bad decisions in this election if it's not corrected, because they're then going on the individual net of, I'm going to do what I think is all right. Since when is I the first thing? What about we? You know what I mean? They're going to play you like an accordion. And then when your butt is up in Trump jailhouse, up for some crypto fascism, you're going to say, oh shit. Or you're going to lie and say, well, no, it ain't your fault. You didn't have no choice anyway, like hell. So the key thing is, so there are levels of this in the African system, and the African Americans have used this system. All our masters have come through this, most of them. But here's the key point. So what is the difference when you pipe in, because this is the high level. See, this level I'm talking about is the level of innovation. No breakthroughs in science occur unless you go through this. Why? Because you will not discover the hidden laws of the universe, of the cosmos, unless you do this. This is the key thing. You will not. All breakthroughs in science come from this realm. And the best breakthroughs in music, art, any other area, and in the case of history, anything that's hidden comes from this realm as well, though you might dig some of it up through finding the primary source. To get the whole picture, you're going to have to go through this. So in this one, what they say about in the Bambara system, those who go to this level and who have received the truth from God and then are able to transmit it to others, they say what they receive is the totality of knowledge, the whole of it. And then they talk about it as you can smell it, see it, touch it. And what do they mean by this? The one who goes through this kind of training is transformed physically, spiritually, and mentally. It's a total transformation. And the truth they get isn't just a fact. It's the whole of a part, or as I said before, the anything and everything. So I've experienced this through the light. I've explained this to people before. And so the twin lineal thing, all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society, that came from God through the light. God told me that's how just societies were organized in Africa. When I found that, that was the key to understanding the foundation of African civilization. That's why you see me following the Twa everywhere. When I wrote the book on Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I didn't know the Twa had, Anu form, agrarian people, had founded Kemet. I didn't know that. It's good I didn't, because it would have taken me another 5 years to finish the book, you know? So this was enough at that time. Or Einstein, when Einstein gets this insight because he knows the fundamentals. See, this applies to all people, but our systems prepare you for this. Theirs, they can stumble into this. And so in his case, he knew quantum physics, but he was average student, average physicist. But he has a dream. He sees himself riding a sled at the speed of light. And then he has an intuition. That's the theory of relativity, that on Earth, time is relative. You understand? Or the same thing in chemistry. The organic table of chemistry would never be discovered through the logical mind. So I'm going to put this in George Washington Carver's thing. I call this piping into God's mind, God's thoughts. And it's a beautiful experience because it envelops you, it changes you. There's a whole process for getting through this. But George Washington Carver called it thinking God's thoughts. Why was he the greatest scientist in the 20th century? Because he knew the basic foundation principles of botany and a lot of other science. But he could then pipe into God's mind because he was one beautiful human being and do it almost all the time. And so he had scores of inventions, all of which helped human beings, thinking God's thoughts. So I'm saying this based on what I know, and a lot of people get put off by this because Christianity tells you can't see God, and how you going to talk to God, and who you think you are. Why would I tell this? Because I'd like to say I'm a genius. I came up with this on my own. Just societies. Oh, look how smart I am. I wouldn't say that, but that would make me feel real good. But guess what? What you call it, I'm not calling myself a genius, but people like George Washington Carver, what makes them a genius? God helped them. God gave them help. It's kind of like you going into an exam with the answers, but he did the homework before that. So what I'm saying is there's another level to primary research. Here's the key thing. If you're not open to spirit, you're going to be shut off from this level. You know what I mean? If you think spirit is spooky, you'll be shut off. And I want to say this, and then I want to get Manu's response, and then I want to do one other thing here before we close this. In my reading of Kemet and of African civilization, I'm surprised at how little spirit is dealt with, other than spiritual, other than, just concepts of truth and ma'at and stuff like that. But as a foundation principle, I'm surprised at how even our African-centered scholars will miss this. And I know why. They've been trained in a European methodology or pedagogy where they fear this. Some actually fear it. Some of them just think it's superstitious and put it to the side. So what do you think of this, Manu?
Important. I covered details of this in a seminar earlier this year. So when I taught the online course this year on the fundamentals of primary research in Africana studies, I laid out the different areas of primary or first-hand research. So I had a complete class just on museum work, another primary research there, primary research in libraries with documents, a third a different component library primary research out in the field. Not only going to monuments, I mentioned temples, tombs, pyramids, ancient residential sites, but another component is the wisdom of the people. So this is the next phase of the work that I started to do. After I went to the monuments, I recognized I needed to go up south because, in the Nile Valley, when you go south, you're going up. So I needed to go up south to Nubia, which borders on southern Egypt, northern Sudan. But I also recognized I needed to go further into Sudan to learn about the ongoing cultural traditions. Then I recognized that wasn't enough. I needed to go further south to South Sudan, also to Ethiopia in the unique Omo Valley. And also the other areas is Kenya, particularly in the area of Lake Turkana in the northern part of Kenya, and in Uganda, because I've learned about the kingdom of Buganda that still continue to practices, and also the Karamoja. The Karamoja, they're linked to a lot of the groups, or some of the groups, I should say, in the Omo Valley, like the Decenage and other groups. So to learn from the indigenous wisdom is crucial and important. The problem is that the archaeologists, they disrespect, they downplay, even historians, and they dismiss the oral history and the ongoing living wisdom because they say, well, oral history, it could change. Well, your views of archaeological discoveries change. You don't have the same views of artifacts. And in fact, the perspective of archaeologists from one generation to the next also changes because they're looking at objects. Those objects or artifacts don't have instructions about who used them, how to use them, and when they used them. So you too are coming up with just your interpretation. How do you dismiss and disregard the living tradition, the oral history, the cultural practices? That's where the wisdom is. And this is what I've been doing now for a number of years, and that is spending time with the indigenous people, because that's another way to know. And it's a huge gap if we're not understanding the wisdom of learning from and being among those traditional people and wisdom. So I learned something from my colleague who might be watching, Brother Andualam. If you're watching, brother, when we first started doing work in the Omo Valley, we were interviewing the translators to these groups, and that was fine. But you use an expression, my colleague, Brother Andualam, he used an expression that we were getting broken information. I love the way he puts that because it is broken. So now when I'm out in the field, we don't just hear from translators and other people. They're okay and they're necessary, but we go directly to the chiefs, directly to the elders, directly to the council of elders, because their level of wisdom is far beyond just what the translators know, and it's night and day. And I can understand it, even though I don't know and speak the languages, but I'm sharp enough to know that there's a difference in what this man is explaining than what we heard before. So that is another area of primary research that is crucial. It's not like sitting around like some people like to do on their computer. They're going to research African history in their computer, and all of a sudden they become you don't become some great scholar in the convenience of your own home, or even if you got to go to Starbucks or the library. You got to get you got to get wet. You got to go out in the field. It's not comfortable all the time because you're on the move, but it's exciting. It's exciting when you're doing your life's work. So that's crucial. And then also, Doc, another component that I've always argued and is more and more relevant as I move through my work out in the field is that nobody's going to understand, particularly ancient African culture and contributions, if we're going back to ancient Kemet or ancient Nubia or Kush, whereby you see artifacts and drawings, unless they are spiritual practitioners. Because if they're not practicing the spiritual culture, then all it is a faulty 21st century intellectual interpretation, or should we say misinterpretation of African spiritual culture in the past. We can't understand it. And people have recognized that with the paintings, like the different paintings in Southern African area. You can't understand that because, or even the Lascaux paintings in France, because these are not regular. It's not regular rock art. These are priests. These are spiritual practitioners who've gone into trance. They've gone into trance in the healing dance, as they come out of the state of trance. They're physically there, yes, and but they have not fully transitioned when they're painting. So they paint images. It looks like a human body, but why is it elongated? Why is it not a human head? It's the head of an emu or something odd and unusual. Yes, this is the spiritual practitioner painting and trying to communicate what his experience in the spirit world. And he's not fully there, because even if you see the body, the person's gone into trance, because when they're coming out of the trance-like state in the circular dance, the person's like, this is on soil. He's swimming to try to get back to a more stable place that he's more familiar with. He's in a deep trance state. He comes out, but his hands are cold. He's able to heal. He's able to understand in that circle who needs to be healed, and then he paints. You can't interpret that. So the arrogant Western methodology of thinking that people can give a 20th century or a 21st century intellectual interpretation of African spiritual practice, it cannot be done. This is why all these people who use the nonsense of Wallace Budge, who is not respected as a linguist. If you look at his hieroglyphic dictionary, and Obing and I were laughing about this. I remember we were driving up to Sacramento one day, but use Wallace Budge, he has question marks a lot of times because he doesn't know the translation. But Wallace Budge, unspiritual, a colonial writer who said he was studying when he's talking about Kemet. This is British scholar. He's talking about Kemet. He called them half-baked African savages. That's who he, in his mind, studying. He's unspiritual. But he and many others, they set the limitations for many folks who want to use this colonial writer who was off base, who didn't know what he was talking about, totally limited, and has no spiritual basis to interpret the spiritual practices that we see in the tombs, in the temples. These are not, when people go to the tombs, and we're not looking at regular art in Kemet. It's different. You have upside down people, for example, and the text says that I need to stand upright because I don't. They say I detest drinking urine and eating feces. This is an upside down person who's nourished on waste. And so it's different. The text is different. The meaning is different. And a spiritual practitioner has the ability to understand that on a level beyond just the intellectual opinion. So if a person does not add that to their research repertoire, the spiritual work that can allow them to understand the Medu Neter, plus they have to be able to read it. And if you really want to know, you got to read the text, you got to read the scene, you must have a spiritual basis, as well as all the other tools and techniques that I learn and teach in academia. But the other component of the spiritual work and learning from the living communities and elders is so crucial. And I don't allow people to just run around and disrespect and downplay oral history so they can elevate archaeology or some other Western approach, because it's limited. Archaeology has its place, but how the hell could that ever be more important than learning directly from the wisdom, the ongoing living wisdom? I've shown elders, for example, when I was in Juba, I've shown elders images from thousands of years ago that they've never seen before. And it's amazing how they explain the scene without missing a beat, because they understand that's their culture. So when I'm in the southern area, I know that these are the Africoid people being depicted. So I listen to them respectfully. I don't have my camera out. I'm not going in there as a tourist. I got my camera, but it's not out. That's at the end. I listen to them. I have my questions. I have the translators if they don't speak English, and we ask questions from different angles, and then I show them the images to get their opinion. It's amazing that the wisdom that the elders give. And so now I know so much more because of all of the things that I mentioned. But in the people, Doc, they've adopted my primary research project as their own, because they see me coming in to learn from them, to share with them as well, but to primarily learn and then share things with them. And they're intrigued by the fact that here's a brother who's not connected to the CIA, who's not connected to the government, but has an individual project to learn from and help them preserve their own culture, but also share things with them. Like, I'll give one example. The Dinka elders, I spoke about them earlier, but in Juba, they told me, because I now can tell the cultural markings. We didn't call it scarification. That's some white boys term. We're not dealing with that. It's negative. So no, it's the cultural markings to distinguish one group from another. And not only that, but there's subgroups. This is what I now know. So if you have the markings across the forehead, you can't just say that that's Dinka per se. You never know. It depends. It depends on how far it goes to the ear. It depends on other subtleties that I now can understand that I didn't know before. But they were telling me that these culture markings, they were introduced by the British. This is what the elder told me. Another elder agreed. They were introduced by the British in the enslavement of the people in South Sudan to determine one group from another. So I listened. I didn't say anything that one day. So when we met again, they were also emphasizing that because we were talking about the cultural practices to distinguish one group from another. So guess what I did the second time? Because it was more appropriate then. I pulled out and showed them a clear image of the cultural markings that clearly are the people from South Sudan that are 4,000 years ago. So I told the elders that the British may certainly have emphasized and focused on the culture markings and encouraged them to distinguish one group from another in their vicious system of enslavement. But the British did not originate these cultural markings, because look at these images from thousands of years ago. So their response was, oh, very interesting, to give them something to think about. But it's not to challenge them, it's to get from them indigenous knowledge and wisdom, but also share with them things that they would not know. Very few people know. In fact, there's so-called Egyptologists and misguided Nubiologists that totally misinformed. Every time a group is shown in the ancient art, they say there's Nubian. These are not always Nubian. Most times they're not Nubian, but they don't know other groups. So they show Nubians, for example, in the Louvre in Paris, and they have the culture markers across the forehead, 6 lines, not Nubian at all, could not be Nubian. These are Nuer by the distinctive marking with the little dip. These are Nuer. There's no debate, no discussion. So it's the field work, it's learning from the elders, it's respecting, not just checking off the box, but respecting oral history as ongoing wisdom. So I agree with what you're saying, because there's different ways of knowing. There's African ways of knowing. And so it's not just somebody getting training in an academy. And should I also emphasize too, the way of knowing of divination, to learn about what is this infant's incarnation objective. Why did they join us? I was talking to one of my former students. He's not a student of mine at the college, but just a student taking my classes, going, and somebody had asked, what am I doing to teach primary research? Is also taking people out in the field on my educational tours. So, I go most summers. And but anyway, I talked with the former student. He also helps in my field work, and he said he and his wife are having their first baby. I say congratulations, and they're looking at a name or names, and I said, yeah, well, you can pick a name, you can be familiar with names, but ultimately, in the traditional sense, your daughter, when she decides to come, when your daughter decides to come, the name is based on how the stars are aligned, how everything, stars, planets are aligned, and specifically what her objective is for coming. That's more accurate, is more appropriate to a person's name, because you want to give a name based on their objective in life. That's another way of knowing, as opposed to just picking a beautiful name from a book, as people tend to do. And we do that, but that's not the most effective way to really understand what someone is here to know and to contribute to the community. So there's definitely more ways to know. I teach the academic part of it, but if we don't add the spiritual component in oral history, there's no way to have a full picture. So that's what I've been working on now for decades as I go out in the field to do primary research. It's not just the Western method. Yes, analyzing written text is fine and those kind of things, but we also have to prioritize at the same level the wisdom of the living community. And I'm at some point I'll publish some of my field work, just interviewing and discussing among the chiefs and elders. And I think it would open up a lot of eyes about the indigenous wisdom that people have.
Yeah, you should. And I think that was a very comprehensive set of examples you gave. And your point of stressing the oral, even in the societies like Kemet that gave birth to writing, they valued the oral over the written, and the written imitated the oral. Why? You won't get the full reason why unless you go into Inner Africa, and particularly the living civilizations. The Bambara, the Dogon, the Yoruba, many others will all tell you the same thing. Why? Why is the oral even more important than the written? And why does the written imitate the oral? Because it's the power of speech. And the power of speech is based on truth. And so why is the oral valuable as a source of history? Because in African civilizations, there's the highest value for truth. You can rely more on this oral history that's been passed on from master to master of a people or any part of the civilization than you can on just pieces of evidence, because there's a rigorous requirement that the people who pass on this information must actually be telling the truth. Because when someone is passing on history, there are other masters sitting next to them. If they make a mistake, they check them right away. And if they make too many mistakes, they're finished. That don't mean they're killed. That means that they're not given any credibility. And these are also initiated people. See, in Africa, when you get to certain high levels, the only way you get through it is through initiation. Most of us just think it's information. Initiation is for transformation, where you die in one state, you're reborn in another state. That's the natural state of life. This has been ritualized. And so you have to go through that to be able to be transformed. So, we started this discussion by the Willie Lynch thing and pointing out the lie of Willie Lynch and the myth that they could take everything from you. Well, see, these Africans who came into enslavement, some of them came out of written and oral cultures. Those were usually Islamic. But most of them came out of oral cultures. Their minds were libraries, So, and they were embodiments of truth. In fact, the average everyday African was viewed by foreigners, whites who observed from the outside. He said they carry themselves like they're regal. That's the key quality of the African right after slavery. My great aunt and my godmother, she was being, she was dancing with somebody and he wasn't acting appropriate. My father tapped him on the shoulder, warned him once. He always gave you one warning because he was putting his hand where it shouldn't be. And he did it a second time. My father knocked him out. Well, what did my godmother say about that? She said he was treating me common. You see, the average Black person has never regarded themselves as common. And that ain't because they all believe that their great ancestor was a king. Because all Africans had this regality about them that came from noble characters, So when I was talking before about on the highest mind, when you pipe into God's mind and you get whole truth, you never get all the truth of anything. That's God's domain. But you get with anything, everything, the knowledge of a particular part. And so this just society, all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society, that is the best definition for justice. Because what is a just society? Males and females. I ran this past my mother when I got the vision. And my mother had been an A student, very smart and very wise. What makes more sense than a society of males and females? They should be equally empowered. She said, that's what my whole life was about. I'm a Leo, she was. She didn't like the fact that the lioness didn't have a mane. She said she was a lion. She wasn't no lioness. You know what I mean? So she had this idea of regality, but the African woman's got to have her say so. But anyone that wants to be free from oppression has got to have power. And that's the big problem. America's got a constitution. They give you all these so-called rights, which we were denied, but the right to speech and the right to assembly. And where's the power, baby? Huh? And if you're going to be free, rights are fine, but can you eat it? You know what I mean? What about the food? Can you put something in your pocket? You know what I mean? What about the money, honey? You know what I mean? What about the roof over your head? There ain't nothing that guarantees that. That's why when you were talking about King reached the conclusion that they had to take it to a revolutionary step. It really isn't revolutionary that you have a roof over your head, that you have money in your pocket, that you have food, that you have some health care, that you have access to education. That ain't revolutionary. That's just a human right. But it looks revolutionary. And King saw that as the demarcation between civil rights and human rights. You know what I mean? So, but the point is, so when I get this vision, that's the whole of a part. You know, it's the whole of a part. You can only get that from God. You got to pipe into that. Coltrane's droning sound came from a heavenly sound that he heard in a dream. See, that's in our culture. So people are always talking about, oh, this backward culture, oh, this, that, and the other thing. It's produced some of the most beautiful people you can think about. How backward is that? You hear me? So this has been a wonderful discussion.
Yeah,
You're
appreciate it.
dealing with a wonderful scholar here, Professor Manu Ampim, and I'm going to put on his daddy right here. This is his father, Baba Kofi. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing just fine.
Can you-
I'm doing just fine.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I can hear you real good. Right.
Okay.
It's in Mobile, Alabama.
Okay.
That's right.
Right on.
the
You
flip
looking
city,
good,
as they call it.
Yeah, you looking real good there,
you
brother.
know?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You
Thank you.
did a
You know,
good job. Your son always acknowledged your role in waking him up. Those books that he got access
it is the genes. I also have to give honor to his mother for choosing me to be the father of our son, because she was brilliant enough to recognize me to be the father of our children. So it is nothing new that why he's doing what he's doing, because of, you know, the upbringing that he had. And, you know, each one teach one. I've always says that each generation have to get stronger. And he carrying that on, and that's what it's all about. But give honor to his mom for choosing me to be the father of our children. You know, his mother was, you know, she chose a good brother. And that's what it's all about. Wisdom.
Yeah. And you produced a wonderful son.
I appreciate it. My mother and father have always been my greatest supporters. So, like when the book History of African Civilization, immediately they'd say, "Okay, send me 10 copies." Immediately.
That's right. That's right.
Day number one.
That's right.
And you know, going to this oral thing, the value of a person is the truth that they embody. And when you can say of somebody, they are their word. What they say is what they do. Of course, saying right. When you can say that, then that's the highest compliment anyone can pay towards any person. And Manu has that quality, and his father, Kofi. I know Kofi. We've worked together, and he's a serious brother, a nice brother. And so, as you say, it's in the genes, it's in the teaching, but in the end, it's in the willingness of those, in your case, that you give birth to pick up the mantle, because everybody that gets raised right don't do right. So that's where you give also the extra credit to the person who takes up the mantle. And I always say to you, I'm proud of you, brother. I'm really proud of you. You know that. And I'm proud of your daddy.
Yes, sir. Well, you know, when I was at Morgan State and I was starting to learn, and one who learns teaches, and I found myself in different teaching situations, and I could be just talking to him about how things are going in general. You know, my father would drop wisdom. So remember, son, as a leader, you got to do things in right order. And it's not that I was telling him anything about me being out of order. He would just drop it in there, and he would drop in other things. You know, in other words, don't let your peace get you in trouble. You know, as a man, and we could be talking about general stuff. He just dropped that in there. You know, so it was the guidance, you know, in my 20s and beyond too. This is why I always give the utmost credit to my mother and my father for the guidance, because as you say, I chose parents that could not possibly be more supportive, and with that foundation of not only good direction but good health. Yeah, with good health, you know, there's nothing more important than having good health as well, you know, and a sound mind. So that's part of the foundation and the value system. So I'm always appreciative. And so when people see me in Oakland, California, or when I go back to Mobile or in any country, I'm the same person. I'm consistently consistent because I'm representing not just myself and my family, but the community and even the ancestors. So I never take these things for granted at all.
Dizzy Gillespie had a saying, because he was not only a great musician, he was also a person who had a good scientific background. And he said that he's talking about music, but it applies to everything. A person's music is an expression of their constituent nature. That's a scientific term. But it's true of our scholarship, of our athleticism, of whatever it is we're good at. And whatever it is, it's an expression of our being, constituent nature. It expresses your being. And so, in giving the example of the highest level of innovation in African thought, that person who is privileged, and it's only 2% in the field that are able to do that, it's a mind, body, spirit thing. It's a total thing. The totality of knowledge is an expression of the totality of being, that you are those things that you speak. That's the key. Western thought, it's just giving out information. They do have people who are the totality of their expressions too, good people. But for the most part, their system is set up to produce flunkies for the system. People who will serve the system and march you off in whatever direction they tell you to go. Technically competent and morally, spiritually ignorant and savages.
Absolutely. And Doc, I might add this too, is that it took me a few years to really appreciate the early foundation and background. But I remember growing up on Scott Street in San Francisco, and I remember this very distinctly that in our room, my brother and I in our room, my mother and father had an encyclopedia set and some books. So every day, waking up and going to sleep, there's books, there's knowledge. And then we had a little tiny apartment, but there was a little room in the middle where I would always see, didn't think of it much of it at the time, but see my father studying, electronic books and things like that. So those had an indelible imprint. So the fact that I'm now a scholar in the field, writing books, that didn't just come about. It came about because I chose parents that understood the importance of knowledge, of getting a formal education, and also giving back to the community. So there's a link there. And and I don't know any of our friends that we grew up with and played with in the neighborhood every day. Nobody had a library in their home, in their apartment. Nobody, but we did, and it was in our room. I don't know if that was just the only place for it. Didn't matter. All I know is I saw books every day. So now the library is my second home, and writing is secondary. It's I do it in my sleep now. So that's the appreciation I give here. So
and I can say the same thing about my mother and father. And generally, it's true. You pick this life you live. It's a question of what you do with it. And you pick a purpose. And the question is, are you fulfilling it? Do you know what it is? And I spent a lot of time on this show going through this. And for people who say they don't know what the purpose is, listen to your heart, listen to your wish, listen to the things that bring you the greatest joy. Listen to those dreams that you have that are most important in your life. That's your purpose. And if you're off track, then try and find your track. And the key point is it involves helping Black folks and humanity do better, taking people to a higher level as you're taken to a higher level, whatever it is, in your way. This show is not about trying to make people into a reflection of anything we're putting out here. It's to encourage you to draw on your own powers to be yourself. And the adage in Africa is to know the truth is to be the truth. And that's real African education. But that's real human education. Anything you want to say as we wrap this up?
Well, I just wanted to, and I appreciate those of you in the chat. I just wanted to see if I can just briefly share the screen because people have asked about the book. So, if let's see here, if I could, well, let me just share the book again. So it's a history of African civilizations, and a second revised edition. This is it here. So hopefully, this is being shown. And so this is the book, and you can get it directly from us at advancingtheresearch.org. And in fact, here's a QR code. So if you all are seeing the QR code, you can scan the code. You can either go to advancingtheresearch.org to buy the book, or you can also scan this QR code, and it'll take you directly to the link to purchase the book. And someone asked in the chat, and directly you can email me at manuampim@gmail.com. That's the easiest way, manuampim@gmail. And you can scan the code here and also get the book. Of course, you can also find me on social media as well. And then one thing I hadn't mentioned manuampim.com because we are revising the site, and it's going to come out more spectacular once we relaunch manuampim.com. So advancingtheresearch.org, that's the site that you can purchase the book as well. All right. And you can find me on Facebook and YouTube under my name.
There was a question also, can you purchase your books at Marcus Bookstore?
Yes, Marcus Books has it. Yes, for
Okay.
sure. Yes.
Okay, let's see. There may be some questions here.
Okay.
Let's see what there is here. M. Jewel, this has been an awfully deep show. And thank you to the two of us. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that, Carol. So
hold on. I'm
oh,
covering this to see if there's any questions here.
oh, okay.
And if there's one you want to respond to, go ahead.
No, I'm just responding to Sister says she just ordered. So appreciate that.
Good. This is Loud to Zoo, Dr. Ampim. How do African people? No, he says, why do African people not have an economic defense mechanism that prevents them from arbitrarily spending their money with their oppressors and maintaining their economy?
If I understand the question, the problem or the challenge is the traditional cultural systems are being overwhelmed by the modern monetary economy. So, like the Ife, the Mbuti, these different groups, the Baka, and these areas, like in the rainforest, the problem is that you have lumber companies chopping down trees and shrinking their traditional areas. You have Africans who want to extend their farmland into the traditional areas where the small statured people live. So they're being forced into the modern economy, which is problematic. And that's not only happening among the indigenous small statured people who live in these communal environments, but we also, and I saw it just in July in the Omo Valley, that you have people around the Omo National Park in the southern part of Ethiopia. They too are being forced into the modern monetary system because the Ethiopian government has taken their land. They've built sugar factories to maximize profits and minimize losses. And they've taken the traditional lands that the people use for grazing their cattle, for farming. So it's forcing the indigenous people in the Omo Valley into the modern economic system. Case in point, I'm there in July. One of my colleagues from the Morsi, the traditional Morsi group, I asked Olusolari, where's Militia, the other brother, who's one of the spokespersons. He's working in the sugar factory. He's forced into this monetary system that is eroding and destroying their traditional culture. So the Morsi and many others are backed against the wall because their land is being taken away and they're being forced into the monetary system. So that's what's happening in various parts of the continent and other parts of the world as well. So these groups, they maintain their cultural tradition and their values because of their isolation from other groups. They're able to live their traditional ways, but because of the encroachment of so-called modernism and the ability to take their land, this is why they defend the land. They defend the land. You don't just go in there. You can, but it could be quite risky to just go in. They don't know who you are. They might think you're a government official, and it's going to be on then. So that's why I'm very fortunate that I have worthy brothers around me and other folks who know the local areas, who know the local people. So we come in with great credibility, because if people are skeptical of people coming in because they don't want more of their land and their traditional cultural values to be eroded because the governments and outside companies are taking over their traditional land areas. And the Omo River has been dammed up, which is a huge problem. They can't use the water for irrigation now and for their animals. And this problem is not only there, but it extends into northern Kenya and Lake Turkana. The lake levels have dropped dramatically because it's not being fed by the Omo River. And these are among the most indigenous groups anywhere, not only in Africa, but in the world, that maintain their traditional cultures. So it's very difficult for them when they're being forced on different fronts to be a part of the modern economy. And I happen to know people who are part of this resistance to having to become so-called modernized. They're not interested in it, but they're being forced to have to do that.
Which usually modernized means being Europeanized. And
Yes.
so one of the reasons why your history and culture is important is that we are still undergoing in Africa neocolonialism, indirect economic colonialism through the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and through nation states that are Western, that have been imposed on Africa or accepted without question by their leaders, very often that way. And they are there, these heads of state, with their guns and everything else that have been provided by the West, to protect the economic interests of the West, which is ripping the people off, the examples you just gave. So part of why African history and culture is important, the best part of it is, as we're disentangling ourselves from the control of outsiders, we have to draw from the best of our cultures to rearrange, reorganize, and transform our societies. And one of the things we need to go back to is the idea that land, air, and water cannot be privately owned. And that was the African traditional system. And in most parts of Africa where you deal with the villages, that's still their commitment. And if they'll sell land, they'll sell it for 50 years. You don't get it. And even then, it shouldn't be sold at all. But that's, again, they're inserting their traditional system in a compromise. So we got to go back to where some of these things actually work. That's going to require a different mindset that's drawing from our culture. There's a question here, Ad one Goodman, not to sound ignorant, but we as a people don't read enough. So is it wise for all of these scholars to spend so much time writing books when they can also burn them?
Yeah, well, we today we're on live video, so it's multiple levels. If people are not reading, that's okay. We're coming to them this way. If they don't want to read, then come join me in the field next summer when I take groups to Kemet in Ethiopia. Also come with me to South Sudan. So if they're not reading a lot, then there's other ways to teach people. And besides, one who learns teaches. So the oral history, oral tradition. And by the way, word of mouth is the best way to spread information, always has been. You can write. Writing is great for communication, but word of mouth is much wider and much quicker if you want to get the word out. So we should be teaching others and sharing with them what we're learning. So I agree. It's not all about writing and reading. That's very crucial. We live in a literate world. You'll never be successful without being able to read and write. Not today. So, but you're right. It's not the only approach. So that's why we're hitting it from multiple levels.
Yeah, and also this medium, they can erase this in a minute. So if you think this is the medium, it's one level. It's not the most important level. And also, while conveying things orally is very important, now that you have this medium of writing, which we had from the earliest of times, it enables you to do more depth. And that depth's important. And yeah, they can burn books and ban books, but they can't eliminate all of them. And so, and just because enough of us aren't reading, so then we should go with enough of us who aren't? No, we don't go to the lowest common denominator. You hear me? More of us need to be reading. You're literate, so why don't you read? You read how a woman looks, how they dress. You read that. You know what I mean? You read anything that's in your interest to read. So why don't you read something that will empower you? You know? So they're all important, and that's why I'm doing this, to hit the younger generation with this. That's why Manu is. But the main one, this writing is very important. Very important. And they're not going to be able to burn all the books. And by the way, I should just point this out. You don't know this. And most of the Africans who study African history don't know this. America doesn't really have a history on essential things. See, we know how they've lied about our history. I don't have time to go into this. It's going to be another part. We do it another time. What our historians have done, because our historians have done, not just historians, our writers on many different levels, African American, the culture, the whole thing. We have done a better job than whites have done of preserving the memory, just in this country. Now, historically, no question, in terms of the best records, we put out the best records, whether it's oral or in writing. Africans have. Kemet, you got a better record of Kemet than you got of Britain. Britain doesn't have much in terms of records. Did y'all know that? And did you know that the only thing new in America is it's not new? That's what's new about America. And if you want to know what's wrong with America, check out what's wrong with Europe. And so one of the key things about America is, I'll just give you one example. There's no political history of the United States. You didn't know that. And don't tell me you did. You didn't. Because I know you don't know your enemy. Some of you talking about voting, for in an election that can throw this election to Trump, really don't know. You haven't got the slightest idea of power at all. But let some fascism kick you up your behind and see what you do with your spaced out selves. Because people who think that are into space. You hear me? And that was okay for Sun Ra. Space is the place. But on this earth, you better be standing on some ground and making some sense. So the thing is, this whole reality right now, we got to deal with the truth, and it comes on many different levels. Let's see, M. Jewel. His question is, should ancient be a term used when the meaning is belonging to the very distant past and no longer in existence? Got any comment on that?
Yeah, I have in the book, and I teach this all the time, is that we could say ancient African civilizations, and that would be accurate. But what's more important, what I advocate, is not saying ancient African civilizations. It's best to call them and classify them as classical African civilizations, because classical means the highest rank, the highest class, the highest value, anything that has permanent and lasting value, the prototype, the model, the guide by which everything else is judged. That's what classical means. We hear about classical music, classical art, classical theater, classical dance. So classical means something of high level, ongoing value, the foundation. So this is why it's best to describe these African civilizations as classical African civilizations. So, we definitely should give ASCAC that called themselves the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations when they formed in 1984. And this is much more important to phrase it and frame it that way, because on the other hand, what mainstream institutions, universities do around the Western world, they have these classics departments. And these classics departments, they are all focused on Europe, just Greece and Rome, and leave out everybody else in the world. And if you ever find a classics department that focuses, not focused, but has a class on Africa or any other society, it's not because they inherently respect these cultures. It's just so they can understand what Plato was referring to, just so they can understand what reference Herodotus is making. And that's it. So most students who get these degrees in classics, they're misinformed because they think that somehow Greece and Rome is above and beyond all cultures in the world, when they're not. These are societies based on slavery. We can't allow these people to perpetuate academic fraud and have these so-called classics department that are, the foundation is only Greece and Rome, and that's all they focus on. That's disrespectful. You have classical African civilizations. There's classical Mayan civilization. There's classical Islamic civilization. There's classical Chinese civilization. There's other classical civilizations, but you never get that in the classics departments. So it's a term that I don't allow our historical opponent to use on their own and exclusively to Europe. So classical African civilizations is much more meaningful than just saying ancient. And that's why I not only teach that, but I have a emphasis on that in the book as well, because this is what will help us to better understand how writers and people in the academic community use terms to mislead and misrepresent the history.
Right on. Okay, we'll close on that. This has been excellent. I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot from you.
Yes, sir, Doc.
Manu.
I appreciate, the opportunity to share, and people are still asking. They can, go to advancingtheresearch.org and just click on news, and then you can order the book. But thanks, Doc. I appreciate it. And I know when you write your first book, not for your next book, then I'll turn you on to the publisher so you can so you can get the same paper, the same quality. But I appreciate the opportunity and to just share a few ideas this morning. Appreciate it.
I want to say that the quality, not only the content of Manu's book is excellent, but the quality as well. Quality of paper, the quality of beautiful colored illustrations. And he come out of his pocket for this. You understand? And you can go into your pocket and get enlightened with some beauty and truth at the same time, because the truth is the ultimate beauty. And Brother Kofi, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in so long. Last time was when we were in Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform. And by the way, Mr. Oscar Wright, who was co-chair with me and was another sister in the group, he turned 100 years old. He had a birthday party about a month ago. Whole community turned out. Mr. Oscar Wright. Are you still on? Unmute. Unmute yourself. Yeah, we can't hear you.
And you know what, Doc?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So, Mr. Oscar Wright turned 100 years old a couple of months ago. He's a Leo, so it was in August. Whole community turned out for him. You know what I mean?
And Doc, he is still at when I moved out to Oakland. He was supporting then. I think he made a donation then just because he saw I was serious. And he even made a donation this past summer to somebody that needed a little financial help to join me and Kemet on the tour. So he's a centenarian and still consistent after all these decades.
And jacked up the person that he loaned the money to or gave the money to. Told them that they needed to be. She was laughing because she's the one that told me. She said he was telling her that you ain't a queen like your mother. You know what I mean? You got to do more. That's Mr. Oscar Wright.
That's right.
So that's a community organizer who also happens to be a multimillionaire who never talks about that. but he's a talented brother dedicated to the education of Black youth. So this has been a pleasure. And I want to say, Hotep, thank you, brother.
Hotep, thank you.
And Kofi, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. I see you in a couple months there. All right. Thank you, Doc. All right. Appreciate it.
Yeah.